I didn't expect this. You're even more beautiful than I imagined.
I was afraid you'd walk away once you saw me.
Now that I've seen you, I don't ever want to look away.
The ballroom shimmered with golden lights as guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled to the sound of live violins. It was the annual Starlight Charity Gala, an event known not only for its generosity, but for its elegance and whispered secrets. Among the clinking glasses and gentle laughter, a peculiar challenge was about to unfold. For the first time, the committee had introduced a blind date for charity auction, pairing strangers for one magical evening, all for a good cause. And at the heart of it, unknowingly, was one of the nation's youngest billionaires. Ethan. Carter, elusive and press-shy, wasn't the kind of man to accept social stunts. But something about the anonymity of being blindfolded, of surrendering control, had intrigued him. Maybe he was tired of being seen for his bank account or his last Forbes feature. Tonight, for once, he wouldn't be judged by his wealth or his fame, just by his presence. His agreement to participate had been the gala's biggest surprise. Behind closed doors, event staff prepped the participants. Ethan's assistant gave him one last nudge, then slid the blindfold over his eyes. He smiled, half amused and half nervous, as the world turned black. Somewhere in the room, a woman he'd never met waited unknowingly to share a table with him. The idea was absurd, thrilling, and completely out of character. Whispers rippled through the crowd as Ethan, led by the hand of a hostess, entered the room like a mythic figure from a real story. People strained to catch a glimpse. Their curiosity, it piqued. But no one, not even the woman chosen to meet him, knew who he truly was. That was the beauty of it. For the first time in years, Ethan was just a man. Across the room, Clara Bennett adjusted her dress nervously. A school counselor by day and volunteer at night, she wasn't sure how she'd ended up in this situation. It had started as a joke among friends, a dare to sign up. She had no idea her partner would become the center of the evening's attention. She was about to meet someone blindfolded, and she wasn't even the one wearing the blindfold. The MC announced the pairings, and murmurs followed each name. When Ethan and Clara were called, the crowd offered a polite round of applause, masking their intense curiosity. As they approached the table together, the magic of the moment took over. The air was charged with mystery, expectation, and something unspoken. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence wasn't awkward, but charged, deliberate. When Clara finally greeted him, her voice was warm and clear, gently breaking the spell. Ethan responded with a quiet chuckle. No names, no status, just two voices colliding under chandeliers. A touching stories kind of moment where even time seemed to hesitate. Ethan wasn't used to this, being led like a schoolboy by the elbow, uncertain of who stood beside him or who whispered nearby. Every sound felt louder, every perfume more intense. Every word spoken by Clara carried weight. Without sight, the world became deeper, richer, strangely more honest. He was discovering a new way to connect, and it startled him. At first, he relied on wit to mask his discomfort. He cracked a joke about mistaking the bread roll for a napkin, and Clara laughed without hesitation. It was genuine, contagious. Something about her laugh made him relax. It wasn't polished or rehearsed. It felt real, like sunlight through thick clouds. They spoke in fragments, about music, about places they dreamed of visiting. Ethan listened closely, drawn not only by what she said, but how she said it. Her voice was confident, curious, full of color. He found himself leaning in, unconsciously captivated. This wasn't some staged emotional story. It felt like something he'd unknowingly been craving. The gala faded into the background. Ethan didn't care about the murmurs around him or the stares that followed. He was caught up in a strange intimacy, one built without appearances. Without knowing what Clara looked like, he imagined her smile, her posture, her eyes. And in a strange twist, he feared taking off the blindfold, feared the spell might break. Clara, on the other hand, was fascinated. Whoever this man was, he listened with the kind of patience that's rare. He didn't interrupt or dominate the conversation. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions and gave her space to share. She felt seen, and he couldn't even see her. That paradox wasn't lost on her. They were served champagne and dessert, and with each clink of cutlery, their connection deepened. Clara noticed the way he gently tapped the table to locate his glass. Ethan joked that he was earning gentleman points just by surviving dinner without making a mess. She smiled. This wasn't just a date, it was an adventure. As the gala host passed by to check on them, Ethan whispered, "Let's keep the mystery going a little longer." Clara nodded, surprised at her own willingness to play along. Whatever was happening, it was rare, unplanned, and it was starting to feel like more than just a game of chance. The conversation shifted to deeper topics as the night wore on. Clara shared her work with troubled teens, and Ethan listened, genuinely impressed. He told stories carefully filtered about his travels and love for architecture, leaving out the private jets and mansions. They found common ground in unexpected places. No money, no titles, just stories. Without realizing it, Ethan was opening up. He talked about loneliness, about how people often treated him like a brand. Clara didn't pry, she just listened. Sometimes, that's all it takes. And somehow, in the absence of sight, vulnerability came easier. Maybe it was because he didn't feel watched, just heard. Clara admitted she'd never done anything like this. She confessed her initial doubts, her fears. Ethan's response was a quiet, "Me too." It bonded them instantly. The more they spoke, the more their differences melted into a shared rhythm. It was no longer about who they were, but how they made each other feel. Ethan asked to hold her hand, not in a flirty way, more like an anchor in the darkness. Clara offered hers, and the moment he touched her skin, something shifted. There was warmth, electricity, a simple gesture but deeply personal. One of those touching stories you don't forget. Time, as it does in moments like this, moved strangely. 1 hour felt like 5 minutes. The music softened in the background as the lights dimmed slightly for the final speeches. But at their table, everything else faded. Ethan's blindfold had become more than cloth. It was a shield, a filter, and a bridge. A part of him wanted to stay blindfolded forever. Because in this darkness, he wasn't a billionaire. He was just a man who found someone extraordinary. Clara, meanwhile, was wondering who this mystery man really was. Could someone this kind, this emotionally intelligent, really be a regular guest? Neither of them asked the hard questions. Not yet. That would come later. For now, the mystery was part of the magic. And as Ethan's fingers gently traced the edge of Clara's hand, she smiled and whispered, "This is the strangest and most beautiful night I've ever had." It was only the beginning. As the gala neared its final toast, the MC approached, their table with a playful grin. "Time to lift the veil," he said, prompting gasps and cheers from nearby guests. Ethan froze. The moment had come. He hesitated for a second, heart pounding like it hadn't in years. What if the magic dissolved with the blindfold? What if it was all illusion? Clara watched his reaction, sensing the tension beneath his smile. "Ready?" she asked gently. He nodded, but his fingers trembled slightly as he reached behind his head and untied the knot. The silk cloth slipped away, and the lights felt blinding. He blinked a few times before his eyes focused on her. And in that moment, the world seemed to stop. She was beautiful, yes, but not in the glossy, superficial way magazines adore. She had depth in her eyes, kindness in her expression, and elegance that didn't shout. Ethan stared for a second too, long, and then laughed in disbelief. "Wow," he whispered. Clara blushed, brushing a curl behind her ear. "You were expecting someone taller," she teased. Their shared laughter broke the tension. But just as Clara began to speak, murmurs rippled across the room. A waiter leaned toward her and whispered something. Her eyes widened. "Wait, Ethan Carter?" she asked, voice barely audible. He sighed and nodded, already bracing for the shift in dynamic. The moment had arrived when fantasy meets reality. But instead of shrinking back, Clara took a deep breath and leaned forward. "Okay, that explains the confidence and mystery, but honestly, I kind of liked you better blindfolded." Ethan burst out laughing, relieved beyond words. The truth was out, and yet nothing had broken. If anything, it made things more real. Guests nearby whispered some snapping photos. The billionaire had been hiding in plain sight, and now everyone wanted a glimpse. But Ethan only had eyes for Clara. He gestured to the host, whispering something in his ear. Moments later, a private garden balcony was cleared just for them. A brief escape. As they stepped outside, away from curious eyes, Clara whispered, "So, now what?" Ethan looked at her, finally seeing her and feeling seen in return. "Now," he said, "we find out if this night was just charity or destiny." And just like that, the next chapter opened, unwritten, uncertain, and full of promise. The air outside was cooler, scented with jasmine and city lights. On the balcony, away from the polished crowd, the atmosphere changed. Clara slipped off her heels and leaned against the railing. Ethan loosened his tie. They were finally just two people beneath the stars. No titles, no spotlight, just honesty. They talked about the irony of the night, how a blindfold had led to the most meaningful connection either of them had felt in years. Ethan confessed that he almost backed out. Clara admitted she had considered not showing up at all. "Imagine if we had," he said, eyes on hers. "We would have missed this." She smiled, and the silence between them turned soft again. Ethan reached for her hand once more, not as a game, not as theater, but as something real. She didn't hesitate. It was in that moment that the story shifted from gala night fantasy to the seed of something genuine, a real story, waiting to be written. Ethan asked her for coffee the next day. Not brunch at a five-star hotel, just a quiet corner cafe where they could talk without distractions. Clara agreed, but with one condition: no bodyguards at the table. He laughed. Deal. It was simple, human, and far more romantic than any lavish gesture. As they parted that evening, there was no dramatic kiss, no grand exit, just a lingering look, a reluctant goodbye, and the feeling that this wasn't over. In fact, it had barely begun. Clara walked away with her heart lighter than it had been in months. Ethan watched her go, his smile small but sincere. Back inside the gala, people speculated and gossiped, but neither of them cared. They knew what they had shared wasn't for show. It was private, sacred, a touching stories kind of night that most people only read about or watch in films. They had lived it, blindfolded yet wide open, and as the doors closed behind them and the music faded into the distance, a question lingered in both their minds. Could love truly begin this way? Or was this just one beautiful chapter in a larger story neither had expected? Sometimes the best beginnings are born from uncertainty. The next morning, Clara stared at her phone, debating whether to text him first. She didn't want to appear eager, but then again, last night wasn't ordinary. As she typed, "Thank you for not spilling the wine," her phone buzzed. It was Ethan. "I still think you're taller when I'm blindfolded." She laughed out loud. They met again and again. Quiet moments over coffee turned into long walks and deep talks. Ethan, let her see the man behind the empire. Clara let him into the quiet spaces of her life. It wasn't easy. There were bumps, schedules, headlines, insecurities, but they fought for it. Day by day, choice by choice. Ethan had dated before, but this was different. Clara didn't want his money, his spotlight, or his fame. She wanted him, and that terrified him in the best possible way. She challenged him, grounded him, reminded him what it meant to feel rather than just perform. One evening, weeks later, they returned to the same garden balcony. This time, no crowd, no blindfold. Ethan handed her a small velvet box, not with a ring, but with the blindfold she had helped him take off. "This is where I stopped seeing with my eyes," he said, "and started seeing with my heart." Clara held the blindfold and smiled. "You know," she whispered, "you never really needed it." They kissed then, not because the script called for it, but because the story demanded it. It was a quiet moment, rich with meaning, a true emotional story, fragile, powerful, unforgettable. Not every love story starts with flowers and filters. Some begin in darkness, in mystery, in moments of surrender. That night at the gala, Ethan and Clara found something no money could buy, and as the seasons changed, so did they, growing not apart, but closer. Each day, proving fate might just be real, because sometimes the brightest love begins when you least expect it. Under glittering lights, behind a blindfold, or in the simplest touch of a stranger who sees you, even when you can't see them. So many people spend their whole lives chasing what they think love should look like. Perfect timing, perfect words, perfect appearances. But Ethan and Clara, they found something deeper, in the dark, in the unexpected, in each other. No filters, no titles, just one blindfolded moment that rewrote their fate. What began as a game turned into the most profound real story of their lives. It wasn't the ballroom or the charity that changed them. It was the raw honesty born from not being able to see each other and still choosing to connect. That's the kind of love that lingers long after the lights fade. And maybe, just maybe, that's how real love works. It doesn't need grand gestures. It needs truth. It needs timing. And sometimes it needs a little mystery, a spark, a glance, a question whispered in the dark. Can you love someone before you see them? If you believe in touching stories like this one, where love finds a way through chaos, masks, and chance, then don't keep this moment to yourself. Share it. Because somewhere out there, someone is still waiting for their blindfolded beginning. Tell us in the comments, would you ever go on a blind date like Ethan and Clara, or have you already lived your own unexpected love story? Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next emotional story that just might change the way you see love forever.